Start it.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. So we're in the sugya of Kosher U'Matir on Rabbizobin base. Last year we discussed the question of what defines kosher. Is the main point of kosher the chaburah, the connection that's created, or is the main point of kosher not the kesher itself that is created? Is the kesher merely a means to an end, or is the kesher the essence of the melacha? We looked at four rayas to this question. One of the rayas was from the Ramah, bringing from the Rishonim already, the smug, that says that if you make a knot in a thread itself, at the end of the thread, you don't need a double knot, even a single knot would be sufficient. We saw this raya is not absolutely muchach, but seems to indicate it's not the chibur, but the creation of the knot that matters. We saw an indication that the melacha is the chibur, the connection, as opposed to the knot, from the symmetrical melacha of undoing a knot, matir, in which we saw even if you just slice through the knot, that's sufficient. We saw another proof from the Ritva, who spoke about if you undo a knot in order to put the connection somewhere else, a different sequence of knots, whether that's called the kasher. And then we saw the Rambam, who talks about twisting threads as a tolda of kosher, even where there's no knot there whatsoever. So we saw a number of indicators around this discussion, but no clear piece of, no clear piece of evidence one way or another. What I want to ask today, in continuing our attempt to understand the concept of the melacha, before we look at, before we learn the sugya line by line, is if kosher is about chibur, about connection, how exactly does it differ from the melacha of toifa, the melacha of sewing, which also seems to be attaching two pieces together? So kesher attaches two strings together. Toifa uses a thread to attach two cloths or pieces of garment together. How do these two melachos differ? I think I put in the source sheet the Rambam in Period Yud, Halacha Yud Aleph. I did. The Rambam there says, in Halacha Yud Aleph, the Rambam says, Hamadabek nioros or uris bekonim shel sofim, if one uses, one uses a glue to stick together skins, or kiyotz v'zeh, how is there told us toifa v'chayev? This is a tolda of toifa and one is chayev. So gluing objects together, the Rambam says, is also a tolda of toifa, meaning to say toifa isn't just stitching, but is any sticking of things together. In which case, how does the melacha of toifa differ with the melacha of kosher? Unless one says that the essence of kosher is the kesher, the knot, as opposed to chibur. But if we think that kosher is more than just a knot, but is chibur itself, then we are left with this problem. How does this differ from kosher? So there's several answers that one can give to this question. One suggested answer is that with
Rambam says kashim as well, doesn't he? Doesn't Rambam say kashim, varim kashim, for that it has to be, or the varim rakim?
With which melacha?
With tofer.
It applies to varim kashim, but it also applies to soft things like fabrics. So that also doesn't seem to be a sufficient answer to the question. So one possible answer one can give to the question is that With toifa, the whole point of toifa is that one is making something into one, as opposed to kosher, in which one is merely knotting something together. So when you sew something, it now becomes merged into one object. When you glue something, it now becomes merged into one object. Whereas when you knot something, you're simply knotted something together such that the knot can be undone. Now, this answer needs tweaking and doesn't stand in its own right. I printed the Aruch HaShulchan, who says something similar to this. And the Aruch HaShulchan here says, told us toifa, a told of toifa is hamadabi nioris bedevek oros zulazu. You stick paper together or skins together. A shari minis chores, other things. Kshimadav zulazu have told us tefira v'chayev. When you stick them together, they are told of tefira and you're chayev. Mali chibur alidei tefira and chibur alidei devek. What difference does it make whether you create a link through sewing or a link through glue? I then put in grey font the continuation of the Aruch HaShulchan, who gets into a discussion about why, when it comes to sofrus, this isn't the case. When it comes to Sifrei Torah and other such ureus, the fabrics of the Sefer Torah, they need to be stitched, not glued, which seems to indicate there is a difference in halacha between stitching and gluing. And the Aruch HaShulchan explains that this difference is one that's relevant to Sifrei Torah, but not relevant to the melachos of Shabbos. So far, all the Aruch HaShulchan has said is really a re-quote of the Rambam, that tefira doesn't just mean stitching, but also means gluing. But then the Aruch HaShulchan carries on. In the rest of the Torah, they always won. The melachot toifa and the melachot of kosher are one. The hagam kosher mechaber hadvarim zeh lezeh. Kosher also sticks things to each other's. This isn't the case. The chibur de kasher royu lahatiro. The point of the merging, the chibur of kasher, is that one can undo it, or and make it back to the way it is. Masha'in came with toifa or madabik, with sewing and stitching. When you want to undo them, revert them back to what they were, you need to ruin them and tear them from each other. Masha'in came for kosher, which isn't the situation in kosher. So the Aruch HaShulchan is coming from the intuition that we had, that the difference between kosher and toifa is the ability to undo it, at least in theory. With toifa, it becomes one thing, which certainly one can see with gluing, whereas with kosher, it's simply an intertwining of the two. Now, I think there's a narrow path that we need to tread when we understand this Aruch HaShulchan. Because if he means a lomdus of whether this is one object or two, whether this remains two objects simply knotted together or one, I think the Rambam that we saw last week of twisting a pasil to make a thread is a disproof of that suggestion. Because in that scenario, I think it is intuitive, it would appear clear that the thread, once twisted, becomes a new entity. It becomes one, it becomes a thread. So I don't think the Aruch HaShulchan simply means to say that toifa makes something into one, whereas kosher is two. On the other hand, I don't think the Aruch HaShulchan can mean a simple physical reality, because there are, at least in theory, cases where stitching can be undone without any damage to the two fabrics. The Aruch HaShulchan says the only way you can undo toifa is with korea, with tearing, which can't happen as opposed to kosher, where you can simply unravel the knot. Now, you can imagine scenarios where there are knots which are very hard to unpick and stitches which are very easy to unpick. After all, the minimal melachot of toifa is creating two stitches. So you can imagine it's easier to put out two stitches than perhaps to unpick a very tight knot. It is true in the case of gluing, again, that we do have an intuition there, that the only way to tear it apart is by tearing. Even there, though, you can imagine a gluing which is weaker, such that it could be dissolve the glue and you could remove it, as opposed without doing any damage to the two fabrics which were glued together. So it seems to me that the Aruch HaShulchan means a conceptual division, but not one as simplistic as does it become one or two. But he simply means that the normal way, the point of toifa, is to make this into one such that it can't easily be unraveled. and therefore normally with tefillah one cuts as opposed to unstitching. And the point of kosher is that it can be unknotted, even though there may be cases where the knot is of sufficient tightness or quality that it makes sense to cut through it, as we also saw in the poskim. So I think the Aruch HaShulchan relies on an appeal to normality as opposed to it being an ironclad mathematical distinction. He's trying to explain to us the general difference between how the two operate, as opposed to an absolute difference between the two. So it appears to me in the understanding of the Aruch HaShulchan, though I can't claim to exactly understand this line of thought, the exact divide, and one can think of scenarios where perhaps it would be unclear which category of malacha it would fall under, but in general, that's the distinction that the Aruch HaShulchan makes.
Wouldn't the idea of Kesher Shel Kayama sort of go against that thought that you...
We will come on to the concept of Kesher Shel Kayama, hopefully even still near the end of today's share. It is a good question. The point of Kesher Shel Kayama is two things. The point is A, that the knot has a certain solidity and strength to it, and B, that my intention is not to unravel it. There's not an immediate plan to unravel it. Nonetheless, I'm using two separate things which can be undone, as opposed to toifa, where the point is to make a new garment such that they can't be undone. That would appear to be the chiluk of the Aruch HaShulchan. Though, as you say, I'm trying to indicate that I'm struggling with it a little bit, because he can't mean a pure lomdus. Does it function as one entity or two? And he also can't mean a pure scientific fact. Then you're inevitably going to damage the garment in one case, not the other.
I had an observation, Rabbi Zobin, that it's interesting in the world of, he refers to kilkul. So we can see here in the world of tefillah, there seems to be, this is a kilkul, which is a malacha. In the case of Korea, it's a kilkul, which is a malacha, whilst of course Rambam's very clear to emphasize generally in the world of kosher, how you can't have the intention to makalkel it, because their kilkul, obviously, we've learned is not a malacha because you're makalkel. So we just see here and emphasize how you can have a kilkul, which is a malacha.
So this is a good point. There's no doubt that once you have done toifa, if you now wish to undo it, you will be left with a worse product than what you started with. But the point is that net, what you have done is an improvement, because you're taking a cloth and made clothing, or whatever the case may be. So in that sense, you do look at the sum totality of the two. And I think we've seen other examples of melachos. I'm trying to remember now where, but in earlier sukkahs, of where there is a kilkul in doing this, and nonetheless, overall, it is good. In fact, if we think about many melachos, I'm just thinking as we're talking, there is a kilkul. If you talk about chaburah, for example, burning, there is a kilkul in the object that's burned, and yet it is a tikkun because of the gain that's there. Or even korea b'chamasoi, when you tear something out of anger and so on and so forth. So I think this point needs more general explanation about the relationship between kilkul and tikkun. But in this case here, clearly the net result is a tikkun, because you end up with joined up pieces of fabric. Okay, so this
Sorry, can I ask a question? Another chiluk that we kind of discussed, though it didn't seem to be brought by anyone, was that perhaps tying is to do with threads, which would also explain why the Rambam holds it's told to twist, whereas dibuk, or whatever it was, or tefillah, is to do where you've got two individual pieces, then you put them together with some other material, right? So whether you sew it with a thread or you glue it with glue, there does seem to be a conceptual difference here, that tying seems to be about tying A to B, whereas tefillah seems to be about sticking A to B with C.
So this is a very good point. I'm hearing in what you're saying two different svaras, one of which I saw and the poskim to discuss, and the other one I didn't, and I'm not sure why not, and whether they didn't consider it a meaningful distinction. One distinction you said is there a C here which is a binding agent? And I think this is a very good suggestion as to, so maybe let's draw a line under the Aruch HaShulchan's answer. We are now going to go on to a new answer to explain the difference between toifa and kosher. And we'll label this new answer Josh's answer. It's also found in the postscript, which is that the distinction is there a binding agent or not? So if we think about the scenarios, both in kosher, classic kasher, and in postal proceeding, the twisting of the threads, there is no binding agent. It's simply from the force and the elasticity of the thread itself that it works. So the nature of the fabric is such that the knot holds with the knot, or the psil holds when I twist the threads, and there is no need for a further binding agent. As opposed to toifer, where the garments have a C, an external thing which binds them, which is the thread that I'm twisting in and out, or the tolda of toifer, where there is a glue that binds the two garments together. And this is a svara said by the postscript, and I think this is a much clearer svara than the Aruch HaShulchan svara. Meaning to say that I understand it better, not that I'm making a judgment between the postscript, but it's one that seems clearer to understand, easier to understand, that a distinction between toifer on the one hand and kosher on the other is the binding taking place by the elasticity and force of the garments themselves, or the thread itself, or is it by introducing a third factor? So that part of your answer, I would agree. You also, Josh, referred to an intuition of maybe the difference is fabrics or cloths versus threads, as opposed to the point of there being a third element that is a binding agent. That chiluk we don't find in the poskim, and they don't seem to consider, they don't seem to have seen this as a significant difference, and this is reflected halacha l'maisa. If I take a cloth and I knot the cloth to something else, this would be viewed as kosher as opposed to toifer, even though it is binding two cloths together. So this doesn't seem to have been a distinction that the halachic system thought was relevant in defining the difference between the two melachos. But what is significant is the other point you mentioned, which is there a binding agent or not? So with cloths and stitches, the thread that's doing the stitching is the binding agent. With the skins and the papers, the glue is the binding agent, as opposed to kosher, where both in the Av form of knotting and in the Tolda form of twisting, it's simply the elasticity of the threads itself which is causing the binding. And this is found in, I saw it quoted in the name of various achronim, but this seems to be a good chiluk. So this concludes the 2 points really that I wanted to mention in terms of defining the essence of the melacha itself. The first was, what is kosher? Is it chaburah or is it creating of a knot? And the second question is, if it is chaburah, how does it differ from the other chaburah melacha of toifer? What I now want to discuss is the issue of kesher shel kayama, and I want to introduce it by saying it is a very, very complicated sugya, and we're going to avoid the complication. As I mentioned last week, there is a perek, more or less, and a large part of the perek's discussion is about defining which sorts of knots one is chayiv for and not chayiv for. We are not learning that perek, we are learning Klal Gadol, Daf Ayin Daled on the base. So I want to just try and draw out the salient features of that are relevant to our sugya and avoid the nitty-gritty about what exactly, in practical terms, is a knot that has a permanence that's enough. It's a professional enough knot, a tough enough knot to be considered a kesher shel kayama. Let's leave all of that out. If we learn the words of the Gemara itself, the Gemara says, "Kosher U'Matir b'mishkan heichahava." Where do we find kosher and matir in the Mishkan? Answers the Gemara, heichadami, heichava. They used to tie the tent to the pegs in order to set up the Mishkan, and therefore this is the melachah of kosher. Ask the Gemara, kosher hahu kosher almanas lahatihu. That is kosher almanas lahati. So this Gemara is exceptionally important. The local question we need to ask in the Gemara is, so what? Where does the Gemara get from that you need kosher almanas lahatim? And there's two parts to that question. The first part is, what is the source of the concept that the melacha of kosher can't be fundamentally unstable and temporary? Why does it have to have a permanence? And the second part of the question is, even if it has to have a permanence, why should my intention matter in this? In other words, if the knot is a perfectly good knot, it's just my intention is almanas lahati, in order to loosen it, who says that's a concern? In other words, even if I accept that there's a halachic principle that a weak knot that has no permanence isn't significant enough to be the melacha, here the Gemara is not arguing that these are weak knots from an objective sense. It's arguing that from me as the binder, the knotter, my intention is on Masechet. Why should that make a difference in the definition of the melacha? So these are the two localized questions. And then there's a broader question, which brings us back to something we discussed right in the early days of when we began learning Perek Klal Gadol. And I want to just simply reiterate over here. In many instances, when learning Masechet Shabbat, melachos, one would be tempted to say, when one asks the question, why does the melacha apply here, not here? One would be tempted to say, because this is how it happens in the Mishkan. And the Gemara indeed seems to say this many times. This is never a good answer by itself. It always needs further explanation. And our Gemara is one of the proof texts for that concept. If you learn Masechet Shabbat, and the Poskim and the Gemara and the Rishonim are full of this language, which is, what about this distinction? Why is this allowed and it's not allowed? And the answer is because this is the way it is in the Mishkan. One can never stop there if one wants to understand Gemara properly, one wants to be a London. One needs to ask, and therefore what? Why is this difference a relevant distinction? Not every difference makes a distinction. If we were merely parroting what happens in the Mishkan, the whole of Masechet Shabbat would look different. For example, maybe we should learn that just like many of the melachos in the Mishkan were only done by Leviim, so only Leviim can't do these activities on Shabbat. Or if we are saying anything that took place in the Mishkan is a melacha, then presumably the Leviim took rest breaks, and or the craftsmen of the Mishkan, Leviim or non-Leviim, ate lunch, took a lunch break. Presumably they walked from place to place in order to construct the Mishkan. Maybe walking from place to place should also be a melacha. We learn Hotzah Shabbos from Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah because of how they carried the poles. But they also did carrying within the space, within a Rosh Hashanah. So maybe we should learn that carrying within a Rosh Hashanah is also forbidden. And what is the extent to which we learn things from the Mishkan or not? And the answer is we always need to use svara still and say, why is this difference significant? Why does it matter? And svara will supersede what we learn from the Mishkan by mere cutting and pasting, by mere parroting. And our sugya is one of the tangible pieces of evidence for it, because let's listen to what the Gemara said. The Gemara said kosher took place in the Mishkan of tying the oyalim to the yosedus, the fabric of the tent, to the pegs. On that, the Gemara says that can't be a melacha because it was al manas lahati. So what? So there's a halachic principle that things, melachas need to be permanent, and this should be a source that that's wrong. This should be a source that the melacha is, even when you do kosher, al manas lahati. You can't argue that in the Mishkan, kosher al manas lahati didn't take place, and therefore it's not a melacha, because the Gemara just said kosher manas lahati did take place in the Mishkan. So if we are learning melachos from the Mishkan, then this should teach us that kosher al manas lahati is a melacha. And the Gemara is confident to supersede what we learn in the Mishkan from what we learn in the Mishkan with svara. And also the Gemara is arguing that kosher al manas lahati, to learn that out as a melacha, would be as ridiculous as learning that moving objects around within a Rosh Hashanah is asa. Or as learning that walking is asa because you have to walk in order to construct the Mishkan. And I was arguing this doesn't make sense for it to be a melacha. So this is an important maramakum in our general understanding of Masechet Shabbat, that the fact that this isn't or is found in the Mishkan isn't and shouldn't be enough for a London. We still need to ask ourselves, and therefore what's the svara? Why is this difference a distinction? Why does it matter that this is how it happens to happen in the Mishkan or not? So this is a general point of introduction. We're running a little bit out of time, and in a sense this is a new sugya. So I just want to reference and tell you what I want to do with the Mara Nakonis that I printed on the source sheet. I put at the end of the source sheet about half a page around the topic of kosher al manas lahati. I will send more sources because since preparing them, I've realized that what I sent was insufficient. But what I wanted to do in this section of source sheet is point out that there is a general rule of melacha that has to be miskayim. A melacha has to have a permanence. And even though kosher has its own features as to how we apply this principle, it's important to look a little bit at this general principle and see how it works. I don't believe in our learning of Masechet Shabbat together as a group, we've yet covered this concept of kiyum, that a melacha needs a permanence. We've assumed it here and there, but it's one of the most important rules of melachas, that they have to have significance, and one of the measures of significance is they have to have a degree of permanence. So it makes sense for us to this is, I think, the first time we've met this principle in the Gemara, and therefore it makes sense for us to see it both within the broader context of other melachas before we look at it in this particular melacha. And therefore I printed here a Rambam who speaks about the concept of kiyum with another melacha, with the melacha of tseveya, dying, and then the Rambam draws out of this and makes a general rule. He says any melacha which isn't miskayim b'Shabbos is pater, and the Maggid Mishnah sends us to look at the Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Beis Amud Beis, which discusses the source of this idea that a melacha needs kiyum in the context of another melacha, a third melacha, the melacha of boineh. So what we see from the sources basically is that this is a rule across many melachas, and the Maggid Mishnah argues that the Rambam derives this as a general rule from boineh, from the Mishnah in boineh, and therefore applies it himself to tzeveya. Here we have another example of this with kosher, though it has unique features about how it behaves in kosher, including the idea that it's not just defined by objectively, like with tzeveya, is this a dye that holds fast or not, but it's also subjectively my intention when I make the kasha. So we'll stop here for today, and the next sugya, or next aspect of the sugya we'll learn, which is actually taking us into reading the Gemara, will be the concept of Amanas Nekayim. Okay, I wish you all a good day.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Sure, thank you very much.
Thank you.